The laughter started before I even finished reading the will. It wasn't quiet laughter either. It was the kind people don't try to hide. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, one hand covering his mouth, shoulders shaking. My Aunt Carol actually slapped the polished conference table and said, "Oh my God, Richard, you didn't." And my father, he smiled, not warmly, not proudly, just amused. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Miss Olivia Carter will receive sole ownership of the Vermont property located on," Daniel interrupted. "Wait, you mean the farmhouse?" he asked, already laughing again. "The abandoned one," my father chuckled. 5 acres, he added casually, like he was being generous. The lawyer continued reading, but no one was listening anymore, because everyone in that room knew exactly what house it was. The broken country house. The one with peeling paint, collapsed fencing, and windows boarded up since before I left for college. The one my father used to call the chicken coop mistake. Meanwhile, Daniel's inheritance had just been announced 10 minutes earlier. A Manhattan penthouse, park-facing, worth more than $1 million. I remember folding my hands calmly in my lap while the laughter continued around me. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I just nodded once and said quietly, "Okay." Inside, though, one thought kept repeating. Why would my father do this so publicly? Because humiliation wasn't accidental in my family. It was usually planned. The strange part wasn't the property itself. It was my father watching me. He wasn't checking if I was upset. He wasn't apologetic. He was studying me, almost waiting for disappointment. Like he expected me to protest. Like he wanted me to fight. But I didn't. And that seemed to disappoint him. The lawyer slid paperwork toward me. "Miss Carter, you'll need to sign acknowledgement of transfer." Daniel leaned closer. "You can sell it," he said casually. "Honestly, Liv, I'll help you list it. Might get enough for, I don't know, a used condo somewhere." More laughter. I signed anyway. And that's when I noticed something small. The lawyer hesitated before handing over the final document, just a fraction of a second, almost like he wanted to say something, but didn't. That hesitation stayed with me longer than the laughter did, because something about this inheritance didn't feel like punishment. It felt deliberate. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask something simple. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it? I always wonder how many people listening have sat in a room where everyone underestimated them at the same time. If you've ever been the less successful sibling, or the one people assumed would struggle, you probably understand why I stayed quiet that day. And if stories about real family dynamics and complicated truths resonate with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe the channel. Because this wasn't the moment everything changed. It was only the beginning. My name is Olivia Carter. I was 32 when my father divided his estate. I lived in Boston then. Small apartment. 2nd floor, loud radiator. Coffee shop downstairs that opened too early every morning. I was an architect, not the glamorous skyscraper kind. Historic renovation, old structures, preservation work, restoring buildings people thought were beyond saving. Churches, brownstones, abandoned inns, places everyone else overlooked. Daniel, on the other hand, lived loudly. Finance, private equity, tailored suits and rooftop parties. My father adored measurable success, numbers, status, visible achievement. Daniel fit that perfectly. I never really did. Growing up, our roles settled naturally. Daniel impressed people. I fixed things quietly. We weren't openly hostile siblings, just unequal ones. At family dinners, conversations followed predictable rhythms. Daniel closed another deal. Daniel's firm expanded. Daniel's bonus. And eventually someone would turn to me. "So Olivia, still renovating old buildings?" I'd smile. "Yes." Then the conversation would move on. I learned early that silence was easier than explanation. The only person who ever truly understood my work was my mother. She loved old houses. She used to say buildings remembered things, that walls held stories longer than people did. She passed away 20 years earlier. After that, the Vermont property was never mentioned again, until the will reading. The house I drove to Vermont 3 days later. 4-hour drive, rain the entire way. The property looked worse than I remembered. The gravel driveway had nearly disappeared under weeds. paint stripped down to gray wood, one shutter hanging sideways. The porch sagged slightly to the left. Daniel had been right about one thing. Most people would have seen a loss, but I felt something else when I stepped out of the car. Stillness. The kind that only exists far from expectation. I walked toward the front door. The air smelled like wet pine and old soil. When I pushed the door open, it groaned loudly. Inside, dust floated through pale light. Original beams, hand-cut stone fireplace, wide plank floors hidden beneath neglect. I ran my fingers along the wall and immediately saw possibilities. Structural integrity intact, foundation solid, historic craftsmanship untouched. Someone had neglected this house, but no one had destroyed it. I whispered to myself without realizing, "You're still standing." And for the first time since the will reading, I smiled. Phone call with my father. My phone rang as I walked through the empty kitchen. "Dad," I answered. "So," he said, "you saw it." I did. Pause. "Well," he asked, "it needs work." He laughed softly. "That's generous." I leaned against the counter. "Why did you give it to me?" Another pause, longer this time. "You like projects," he said finally. "That's not an answer." "It's fair," he replied. "Daniel needed liquidity. You needed something meaningful." The phrasing felt rehearsed. "Did Mom like this house?" I asked. Silence again. Then quickly, "It was an investment mistake. Don't romanticize it." His tone shut the conversation down, but something inside me shifted, because my father avoided emotional topics only when they mattered. Renovation began slowly. I hired 2 local contractors, Ben and Marisol. First walkthrough, Ben tapped a beam. "Structurally, this place is shockingly good." Marisol nodded. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." I felt a strange sense of pride, like the house was quietly defending itself. We started clearing debris. Day 3, Daniel called, speakerphone on while I measured window frames. "So, serious question," he said. "You're not actually planning to live there, right?" "I'm restoring it," he laughed. "Liv, come on, you could sell the land and walk away. I want to see what it becomes." "You always do this," he said. "Do what?" "Fall in love with lost causes." His words lingered after the call ended, because they sounded less like teasing and more like dismissal. That night I walked the property alone. 5 acres stretched into forest. Quiet, undisturbed, and then I noticed something odd. Near the back boundary, a newer fence post. Different wood, recently replaced. I frowned. Why would anyone maintain fencing on an abandoned property? I made a mental note. At the time, it felt insignificant. It wasn't. First visit from my father 2 weeks later, my father arrived unannounced. Luxury SUV against muddy gravel looked almost absurd. He stepped out carefully, scanning the house. "Well," he said, "you've certainly committed." We walked inside, dust gone, windows uncovered, light pouring through rooms. He looked unsettled. "You're spending money on this." "It's an investment." He shook his head slowly. "I thought you'd sell." I watched him instead of answering, because he wasn't pleased. He looked nervous. We stood in the living room. He ran his hand across the fireplace stone, then quickly withdrew it. Like touching something familiar made him uncomfortable. "You don't have to prove anything, Olivia," he said. "I'm not." Another silence. Then he added casually, "If renovation costs get high, we can reconsider ownership arrangements." That sentence landed wrong. "Ownership isn't temporary," I said. He smiled thinly. "We'll see." Renovations accelerated over the next months, and so did strange interruptions. First, a real estate agent showed up claiming the property might be listed soon. I told her it wasn't. She looked embarrassed. "I received an inquiry from your family office," she admitted. Family office. My father's financial management team. I called him immediately. "Why is someone trying to list my property?" "Oh, administrative confusion," he said smoothly, but his voice carried irritation, not surprise. Second incident, a surveyor appeared measuring boundary lines. He claimed he'd been hired by Carter Holdings. Again, my father. When I confronted him, he laughed it off. "You're being paranoid." But I wasn't, because every action suggested one thing. Someone expected this house to change hands eventually. One afternoon, while restoring kitchen cabinets, Marisol asked, "Can I say something?" "Of course." You talk about this house like it belongs to you emotionally, but people keep showing up like it doesn't. I paused. I've noticed. She wiped dust from her hands. My grandmother used to say when too many people watch a property, there's usually something valuable nobody talks about. I laughed lightly. There's no hidden treasure. She shrugged. Maybe not money. Her words stayed with me. 3 months into renovations, I returned to the lawyer's office to request original property records. He recognized me immediately. Miss Carter. He hesitated again. Same hesitation from the will reading. I'd like full title history, I said. He adjusted his glasses. You haven't reviewed the supplemental documents. What supplemental documents? He froze, then slowly opened a drawer. There was an additional file attached to your inheritance. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in 20 years. My mother's handwriting. My chest tightened. Why wasn't this given to me earlier? He cleared his throat carefully. Your father instructed delivery only upon property acceptance and occupancy. I stared at the envelope. My hands suddenly felt unsteady. Is there a problem? I asked quietly. The lawyer chose his words carefully. I would recommend reading it before making any financial decisions. Driving back to Vermont, the envelope sat on the passenger seat. I didn't open it immediately. I kept thinking about my father's behavior, his disappointment when I accepted the house, his attempts to list it, the surveys, the sudden concern about ownership, and now my mother. What could she possibly have left behind tied to this property? The house appeared through the trees as sunset turned the sky orange. For the first time since inheriting it, I felt like I wasn't renovating a forgotten building. I was uncovering something intentionally hidden. I sat at the old kitchen table, dust replaced by fresh wood scent. Renovation plans spread around me, the envelope in front of me, my mother's handwriting. For Olivia, only if you choose the house. My heartbeat slowed. Outside, wind moved through the trees. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter and a notarized document. The first line made my breath catch. Olivia, if you are reading this, it means your father underestimated you again. I kept reading. And halfway down the page, I realized something impossible. The Vermont house was never truly my father's to give away. I read the first line 3 times before my brain accepted it. Olivia, if you are reading this, it means your father underestimated you again. My mother's handwriting hadn't changed in memory. Rounded letters, slight right tilt, calm confidence even on paper. The kitchen around me felt suddenly smaller. Outside, wind brushed against unfinished siding, producing a low, hollow sound through the house. I kept reading. 20 years ago, when your father believed this property was a failed investment, I made arrangements to protect it. I knew one day it might matter, especially to you. My fingers tightened around the page. Protect it? From who? The answer came immediately in the next paragraph. Your father sees property as leverage. I saw this house as freedom. A second document slid from the envelope. Notarized. Stamped. Legal language dense and unmistakable. Irrevocable Heritage Trust Agreement. My name listed as primary beneficiary. Execution date, 20 years earlier. I sat back slowly. The realization formed piece by piece. My father hadn't truly owned this house. He had controlled it, managed it, but ownership had been locked into a trust my mother created. And according to the document, transfer required my voluntary acceptance. If I refused the inheritance, the trust dissolved back into Carter family holdings. But if I accepted, the property became legally protected under conditions my father couldn't alter. I whispered into the empty room. You planned this. A strange warmth settled in my chest. For the first time since she died, it felt like my mother was still guiding something. Suddenly everything made sense. My father's disappointment when I accepted. The real estate agent. The surveyors, his suggestion to reconsider ownership. He wasn't mocking me. He had expected me to reject the house. Daniel was supposed to inherit everything eventually. The penthouse now, the Vermont land later. But I had interrupted that plan simply by saying yes. And the biggest question hit me. What was so valuable about this property that my mother built legal armor around it? Because it wasn't just sentimental. She had anticipated conflict. which meant she knew something my father never wanted revealed. I called the estate lawyer immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Miss Carter, you knew about this trust." Pause. "Yes, why didn't anyone explain it?" His voice lowered carefully. "Your mother left explicit instructions, disclosure only after acceptance." "Did my father know?" Another pause, longer this time. "He knew there were protections," the lawyer said. "I'm not certain he understood their extent." I stared at the exposed ceiling beams above me. "What happens if someone tries to force a transfer?" His answer came without hesitation. "They can't." Silence filled the line. Then he added quietly, "Legally speaking, this may be the most secure asset in your family." I hung up slowly. Outside, evening light faded across the property. The house no longer felt abandoned. It felt defended. I walked through each room afterward differently, not as a renovator, as a keeper of something intentionally hidden. My mother had never fought loudly in our family. She moved quietly, strategically. And now I realized this house was her final move. But the mystery deepened. Because legal protection alone didn't explain my father's urgency, he wasn't just annoyed. He was worried. In month 6 of renovation, the transformation accelerated. New roof installed. Windows restored. Original floors refinished into warm honey tones. Design blogs started noticing the project after Marisol posted progress photos online. Comments poured in. "Is this going to be a retreat? Historic Vermont restoration? Please tell me this will be rentable." I hadn't planned a business, but ideas started forming. Boutique stays, creative retreats, architectural restoration experiences. The property wasn't just livable. It had potential, real potential. And that's when my father's behavior changed dramatically. He arrived without calling again. This time he walked fast, tension visible. "You've invested a lot," he said immediately. "Yes." "How much?" I gave him a number. His jaw tightened. "That's significant. It's my property." He forced a smile. "Of course." But his eyes moved constantly, windows, land, back acreage, like he was assessing something beyond the house itself. Then he said it. "You could partner with Daniel." I crossed my arms. "For what?" "He understands investment strategy. I understand my property." His tone sharpened slightly. "You don't need to handle this alone." I felt the first flicker of suspicion turn into certainty. This wasn't concern. It was control. "I'm not selling," I said calmly. His expression hardened for a split second before softening again. "We'll talk later." He left quickly, too quickly. Emotional shift confusion turned into alertness. I stopped assuming coincidence. Every action now felt connected to the trust, and to something hidden on this land. 2 weeks later, Ben called me outside during landscaping work. "Olivia, you should see this." We walked to the back acreage, near the newer fence post I'd noticed months earlier. Excavation equipment had exposed something buried shallow beneath soil. Concrete, perfectly rectangular. About 10 feet long, not natural, not agricultural. Ben crouched beside it. "This isn't part of the house foundation." Marisol joined us. "Looks like an old utility structure," she said. My heart began to race. Because suddenly my mother's letter echoed in my mind. I made arrangements to protect it. "What's underneath?" I asked. Ben shook his head. "No idea, but someone intentionally buried this." The air felt heavier, the forest unusually quiet. For the first time, excitement mixed with unease. What exactly had my mother protected? The next morning, I visited the county records office. An older clerk named Alina helped me search historical permits. After 30 minutes, she frowned. "That's odd." "What?" "There's a restricted filing attached to your parcel." "Restricted?" She turned the monitor slightly. "Utility easement registered privately, filed by Margaret Carter," my mother. Date matched the trust creation. "What kind of utility?" I asked. Alina adjusted her glasses. "It doesn't specify publicly. That usually means corporate confidentiality." Corporate. Why would my mother file a corporate easement on rural land? Unless, the realization formed slowly. This property wasn't valuable because of the house. It was valuable because of what sat beneath it. That night I researched regional infrastructure expansion, energy corridors, fiber lines, land acquisitions, and then I found it. a planned Northeast high-capacity data infrastructure project, still confidential in many filings. Projected expansion zone ran directly through my property line. A private company had quietly secured rights decades earlier, locked under my mother's trust. Meaning, the land wasn't just scenic Vermont acreage. It was future infrastructure territory, worth millions, possibly tens of millions. My father must have discovered this recently. He had tried to maneuver ownership before I realized, and failed, because my mother had ensured only one person could ever control it. Me. I sat in the living room surrounded by renovation blueprints. Everything aligned at once. The will reading humiliation, the laughter, the worthless house. My father assumed I would reject it. Daniel would inherit cleanly later. The trust would collapse. Asset returned to family control, but I accepted, and accidentally blocked a long-planned financial strategy. I whispered aloud. You didn't give me a burden. You tried to trick me into refusing an empire. Anger didn't arrive loudly. It arrived cold, clear, intentional. For the first time, I stopped reacting emotionally to my family and started observing them strategically. Silent revenge preparation phase begins. I told no one what I discovered. Not Daniel, not my father, not even Ben or Marisol. Instead, I changed how I behaved. I became agreeable, calm, unthreatening. When my father called, I sounded uncertain. I don't know if I can manage this project long-term, I admitted casually. He relaxed immediately. Good. Let him believe that. Meanwhile, I hired a property attorney, an infrastructure consultant, a commercial valuation specialist, all under strict confidentiality. Each confirmed the same conclusion. The land alone would soon become one of the most valuable private parcels in the region. My mother hadn't preserved nostalgia. She had secured leverage. Daniel phoned one evening. So Dad says the renovation's getting expensive. I laughed lightly. It is. You sure you want the stress? What do you mean? Well, honestly, Liv, if it becomes too much, I could take it over. Help you out. There it was, the offer disguised as generosity. I'll think about it, I said. He sounded relieved. Yeah, no pressure, just family helping family. After the call, I sat quietly. Two internal thoughts surfaced. They still think I don't understand. Good. Winter arrived. Snow covered the restored roof. The house transformed into something stunning. Design magazines requested features. Bookings inquiries started arriving even before opening. The chicken coop had become a destination. And then my father requested a family dinner. Formal, mandatory, at his home. The tone alone told me everything. Something had changed. He was done waiting. Dialogue, the invitation Sunday evening, he said over the phone. We need to discuss family assets. Family assets. Not dinner, not catching up, assets. I'll be there, I replied calmly. After hanging up, I walked through the house slowly. Fireplace lit, warm light against restored wood. My mother's letter resting on the mantel. I touched it gently. I understand now, I whispered, because this dinner wouldn't be casual, it would be negotiation. And they still believed I was the weakest player at the table. Sunday arrived. I entered my father's dining room. Daniel already seated. Legal folders stacked beside him. Two unfamiliar men in suits. And my father didn't even pretend warmth. He folded his hands and said, Olivia, we need you to transfer the Vermont property to Daniel within 72 hours. The room went silent. They expected resistance. They expected emotion. Instead, I smiled. Because by then, I already knew something they didn't. The house could never belong to them again. 72 hours, my father repeated calmly, folding his hands on the dining table like this was a business acquisition, not a family conversation. That's more than reasonable. The chandelier above us cast a soft yellow light over polished wood and untouched wine glasses. Daniel avoided eye contact. The two men beside him opened leather folders simultaneously. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just asked one question. On what basis? One of the men cleared his throat. We represent Carter Holdings. There are restructuring concerns involving long-term family asset management. That's vague, I replied evenly. My father's voice sharpened slightly. You don't have the infrastructure to manage what that property is about to become. There it was. Confirmation, they knew. Daniel finally spoke. Liv, this isn't personal. It always is. We're consolidating development rights, he continued. Investors are already circling. I tilted my head slightly. Investors for what? Silence. A quick look passed between my father and one of the lawyers. That hesitation told me everything. They hadn't expected me to ask precise questions. They still thought I didn't understand the land's value. I'm not signing anything tonight, I said calmly. My father's jaw flexed. You're being emotional. I almost laughed. Emotional. I had never felt clearer. The next morning, the pressure campaign began. First, a call from Daniel. Dad's trying to protect you, he said immediately. From what? From legal exposure. I leaned against the kitchen counter in Vermont, looking out at snow-covered trees. What exposure? You signed trust documents without reviewing future easement implications. I reviewed them. Silence. Then he shifted tone. Okay, look, there's a tech infrastructure corridor planned, massive expansion. The land will be commercial soon. You don't want to negotiate with corporations alone. There it was, finally said out loud. I'm not alone, I replied quietly. Liv, he exhaled, frustrated. You're an architect. This is corporate territory. Two thoughts crossed my mind simultaneously. He still sees me as small. Good. I'll consider options, I said neutrally. He sounded relieved again. Mistake. Second tactic, social pressure. My Aunt Carol called. Sweetheart, your father is under enormous stress. I'm sure. You don't want to damage family unity over pride. Pride. Interesting word. It's just land, she added softly. It wasn't just land. And everyone suddenly cared too much for it to be just land. Third tactic, intimidation. A courier delivered a thick envelope to the Vermont house. Inside, a formal offer. Large number, 7 figures, transfer within 72 hours. I scanned it carefully. They were trying to buy me out before public infrastructure announcements raised the price tenfold. Calculated, aggressive, rushed. That told me something critical. Time mattered. And they were running out of it. I stopped answering emotional appeals. No arguing, no defending, only gathering. I met with my attorney, Claire, in Burlington. She read the offer twice, then looked at me carefully. Do they know about the secondary clause? I kept my expression neutral. They might not, she nodded slowly. Then they're bluffing power they don't actually have. The secondary clause, my mother's final safeguard, buried halfway through the trust. If any Carter family entity attempted coercion or forced acquisition, full ownership converted to independent legal protection under my sole corporate control. Irreversible. They weren't just trying to pressure me. They were risking losing influence entirely. Claire leaned back. If you want leverage, let them push. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, control. 2 days later, Daniel showed up in Vermont unannounced. Snow falling lightly. His expensive coat looked out of place against restored cedar siding. He walked through the house slowly, visibly impressed despite himself. Okay, he admitted quietly. You did something here. Thank you, he turned toward me. You don't have to prove anything anymore. I folded my arms. I'm not proving. You always needed Dad to see you as capable. That landed. Because there was truth in it. Past tense truth. I don't need that now, I said calmly. He stepped closer. You think this is about you building something? This is about scale, live, corporations, infrastructure. You'll get crushed. I held his gaze. Are you worried about me or about losing it? His silence answered everything. The tension in the room shifted. He tried a softer tone. Let's co-develop it. 50-50. Under Carter Holdings? Yes, meaning under my father. No. His patience snapped slightly. You're being stubborn. I'm being informed. His eyes narrowed. What do you know? I let the question hang, then said evenly. Enough. That night my phone rang from an unknown number. Miss Carter, a polished voice began. This is Jonathan Hale with Northeastern Data Infrastructure. There it was, direct contact. We understand there may be internal family restructuring occurring around your Vermont parcel. Carefully worded. Yes, I replied. We'd prefer to negotiate directly with the controlling owner. Controlling owner, not Carter Holdings. Me, what are you offering? I asked calmly. He gave a preliminary number. It made Daniel's offer look almost insulting. "And that's before public announcement," he added. "Why the rush?" I asked. He paused. "Because once news goes public, competitive bidding begins." After the call ended, I stood very still in the living room. The fireplace crackled softly. My mother hadn't just protected land. She positioned leverage at the perfect intersection of timing and secrecy. And my father had tried to outmaneuver me before I understood it. This was never about Daniel needing assets. It was about my father maintaining control of everything, even from retirement. He laughed at the will reading because he believed he had already calculated the outcome. He underestimated one variable, me accepting the worthless house, and then understanding it. On the final evening of the 72-hour window, my father called directly. No greetings. "If you don't transfer the property, you'll fracture this family permanently." The statement was calm, controlled, measured. I sat at the restored dining table inside the Vermont house. "Was this family intact?" I asked quietly. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said. "I'm being observant." He shifted tactics. "Daniel's firm is over-leveraged." That caught my attention. "What does that have to do with my property?" Silence. Then carefully, "He structured future expansion assuming consolidated inheritance." Meaning, Daniel had borrowed against anticipated assets, including Vermont, without securing them. Risky, arrogant. "Did you encourage that?" I asked. "You're focusing on the wrong thing." "No," I said evenly. "I'm not." The pieces aligned rapidly. If I refused transfer, Daniel's firm could collapse. Publicly, financially, and my father knew it. This wasn't just pressure, it was desperation. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I simply said, "I won't transfer ownership." Silence, heavy, cold. Then he responded, voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "You're making a mistake." "No," I replied softly. "You did." And I ended the call. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the underestimated daughter. I felt like the only person at the table who had read the full contract. The next step required precision. I agreed to one more family meeting, public, at the Vermont house. I framed it as reconciliation. "Let's discuss options openly," I told Daniel. He agreed quickly, too quickly. My father hesitated, but accepted. What they didn't know, Claire would attend. Jonathan Hale would attend. And I had copies of Daniel's leveraged expansion filings, not to destroy him, but to reveal truth. Calmly, factually, irrefutably. Snow had melted by then. The house stood fully restored, warm wood exterior. Large glass windows reflecting open sky. Cars arrived one by one, Daniel first. Nervous, my father next. Rigid posture, then Claire, then Jonathan. Daniel noticed him immediately. "Who's that?" I smiled slightly. "An interested party." We all gathered in the living room, natural light flooding the space. The house that once drew laughter now felt imposing, grounded, unmovable. My father looked around slowly. "You've elevated it." "I have." We sat. No small talk, no wine, just documents on the table. I began calmly. "You asked for 72 hours. Silence. "I used them." Daniel shifted in his seat. My father's expression hardened. "What is this?" he asked. "It's clarity." I slid the trust document across first. Highlighted clause visible. Claire spoke evenly. "Any coercive attempt by Carter-affiliated entities triggers independent conversion." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied gently, "that by pressuring me, you already forfeited influence." My father went very still. Jonathan then placed a corporate valuation sheet beside it. Projected infrastructure route outlined clearly. Daniel's face drained of color. "You knew," he whispered. "Yes." The room shifted. Power no longer implied. Power visible. But the real exposure wasn't the land value. It was the leverage. I slowly placed Daniel's expansion filings on the table. Signed. Dated. Referencing projected asset consolidation. My father's name appeared as advisory guarantor. Daniel looked at him. "Dad," the silence between them said more than any argument could. I spoke softly. "You built your future on something you didn't own." The room felt suddenly fragile, and that's when I understood something else. This wasn't just financial ambition. This was inheritance manipulation that started long before the will reading, and I was about to finish what my mother began. No one spoke for several seconds. The only sound inside the living room was the soft ticking of the restored wall clock I'd found buried under insulation during renovations. Daniel stared at the documents like they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. My father didn't look at the papers. He looked at me, not amused anymore, not confident, calculating. "You brought outsiders into a family matter," he said carefully. His tone stayed calm, but there was tension underneath it now. I sat across from him, hands folded loosely. This stopped being a private family matter when legal pressure started. Claire remained silent beside me, letting the words settle. Jonathan Hale flipped one page toward Daniel. Projected valuation numbers filled the center. Daniel swallowed. "These projections, they're real," Jonathan nodded professionally. "Our company does not attend speculative meetings." The shift was subtle but powerful. For the first time in my life, Daniel wasn't leading the conversation. He was trying to catch up to it. Daniel turned to my father. "You told me Vermont was a backup asset," he said quietly. My father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, a small habit he had whenever control slipped. "It was," he replied. "Dad," Daniel pressed, voice tightening, "my expansion financing assumed consolidation." Silence stretched. I watched them carefully. Two internal thoughts surfaced. This is the first honest conversation they've ever had, and it's happening because control moved. My father finally spoke. "I expected Olivia to sell." He said it plainly. No apology, no hesitation. Just fact. Daniel blinked. "You never told me that." "I didn't think it required explanation." The air changed. Daniel leaned back slowly, realization dawning. "You gambled my company on an assumption." My father's jaw tightened. "I made a calculated decision." Daniel laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "That's not calculation, that's betting on Olivia failing." No one looked at me, and strangely, that felt like relief. For once, I wasn't the emotional center. I was the reality everyone had to adjust to. I remembered the will reading, the laughter, the way my father watched me sign. He wasn't celebrating fairness. He was watching a plan unfold. Except the outcome changed the moment I accepted the house. My mother had anticipated this exact moment. Not confrontation, correction. I spoke quietly. "I'm not here to destroy anyone." All eyes turned toward me. "I'm here to clarify ownership and future decisions." Jonathan nodded slightly. Claire slid another document forward. An independent development proposal. My proposal. Boutique retreat operations preserved. Land leased, not sold, for infrastructure rights. Long-term revenue. Environmental protections intact. Daniel read quickly. His expression shifted again. "You're not selling outright." "No, you're keeping control." "Yes." He looked genuinely surprised. "You could walk away with a fortune immediately." I smiled faintly. "I didn't restore this house to hand it over." My father finally spoke again. "You're thinking emotionally." I shook my head. "I'm thinking long-term." And for the first time, he had no counter-argument. But the real moment came next. I placed my mother's letter on the table. "I want you both to read this." My father hesitated, then picked it up. His eyes moved slowly across the page. The room stayed silent long enough to feel uncomfortable. I watched subtle changes in his expression. Confidence, irritation, recognition, something softer. Memory. When he finished, he didn't immediately speak. Daniel leaned closer. "What did Mom say?" My father handed him the letter. Daniel read aloud quietly. "Richard believes inheritance creates loyalty. I believe independence creates strength." His voice faltered slightly. Another line. "If Olivia chooses this house, it means she chose herself." The words hung in the air. No accusation, no anger, just understanding. My father exhaled slowly. "She always thought differently than I did." It wasn't defensive. It sounded tired. Something unexpected happened then. The story everyone believed about our family shifted. Daniel looked around the restored house. "You knew she built this trust." My father nodded once. "I knew she added protections." "You didn't know how strong they were." "No," he looked at me again. "I didn't expect you to accept the property." I answered honestly. "I didn't expect it to matter." The room softened. Years of unspoken assumptions rearranged themselves quietly. The less successful daughter, the responsible son, the strategic father. All incomplete narratives. This house had rewritten them without anyone realizing. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated facts. I will retain ownership. No one argued. I will lease infrastructure rights under conditions I approve. Jonathan nodded agreement. And the retreat remains independent. Daniel closed the folder slowly. So, there's no transfer. No, he looked at my father, then back at me. After a long pause, he laughed softly. Not mockery this time. Respect. You won, he said. I shook my head gently. I built something. That was the difference. Revenge wasn't destruction. It was permanence. The laughter from the will reading had transformed into silence filled with recognition. The meeting ended without drama. No shouting. No slammed doors, just quiet acceptance. Jonathan left first, then Claire. Daniel lingered near the fireplace. You really did all this alone? He asked. Not alone, I said. Just without permission. He nodded slowly. I underestimated you. I know, he smiled faintly. I think we all did. When he left, my father remained. We stood in the doorway watching evening light stretch across the property. After a long silence, he said, You remind me of your mother. I didn't respond immediately. He continued. She believed control wasn't the same as security. Another pause. I thought I was protecting the family. I answered carefully. You were protecting certainty. He absorbed that, then nodded once. No apology, but understanding. For us, that was enough. He left quietly. No laughter, no instructions, just acceptance that the foundation had changed. The retreat opened officially that fall. Booked months in advance. Architects, writers, couples escaping cities. The Vermont house became known as a place where people rebuilt things, projects, relationships themselves. Infrastructure negotiations finalized quietly in the background. Long-term income secured. Financial independence achieved without selling the land. Daniel stabilized his company through restructuring. We spoke occasionally now. Less competition, more honesty. My father visited once. He walked the property slowly, hands behind his back. At sunset, he said, You turned the worst gift I ever gave into the best decision you ever made. I smiled. I think Mom planned that. He didn't disagree. Sometimes guests ask why I kept the original beams instead of replacing them. I tell them old structures deserve respect. They survived things unseen. Families are similar. Some foundations crack under pressure. Others reveal their strength only after being tested. I didn't win by taking something from my family. I won by finally standing on something that was mine. The laughter stopped mattering the moment I understood the house wasn't a rejection. It was an invitation to build without approval, to succeed without comparison, to choose myself exactly as my mother hoped I would. And strangely, once I stopped needing validation, respect arrived naturally. Now I'm curious about you. If you were in my position, would you have transferred the property to keep family peace? Or protected what was rightfully yours even if it changed relationships forever? Who do you think was truly wrong here? My father, my brother, or the assumptions we all carried? Tell me what you would have done. Because stories like this always reveal more about us than about inheritance. And lastly, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so you don't miss next one. Also, it gives us motivation to keep bringing you the new ones. Thanks for watching, folks.